Okay? Good evening. I'm going to start with a few points of rebuttal. Before that, I'd like to tell you what my points are going to be about. The first one is going to talk about how what we're doing is actually just extending the status quo. And the second one is titled Children as Guinea Pigs. So first, a few points of rebuttal, which are quite a few since all men here spoke quite quickly. So the first point, parents are under a lot of pressure. Yes, parents are under a lot of pressure. That's why we're worried about them. That's why we want to make sure that they're supervised so they don't do anything stupid. Second, when it comes to privacy, like we showed here by the first government, privacy is all good and well, but we do interfere in cases of abuse and neglect. And this is what we're doing here. We're worried about cases of abuse and neglect, so we don't take all kids out of their parents. We make sure to monitor them in a proportional manner. In regard to the fact that there's only 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million, I don't know where my colleague here gets his statistics from, but I wish. Cases like this are much more common, and even if we're willing to accept your proposition, there's only 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000 cases of kids being abused is something that we do want to prevent. Also, in fact, that the argument about the fact that there's going to be more mistakes, this whole argument about cultural bias, this actually leads to the argument that there's going to be less mistakes, because as soon as you supervise everyone, and not just the people in the poor sectors, you have this situation where you create an objective frame of reference. You know what is actually proper, you know what's actually done everywhere else, and you can decide whether or not this is time to take the kid away, or not time to take the kid away. In regard to the humiliation, I'm sorry for my friend here who doesn't really understand the fact that we don't want people who are crazy driving on the streets, and that it's necessary. Just like when you go to the doctor, you understand when he asks embarrassing questions because he needs to know. The social worker needs to know. Additionally, it's not embarrassing if every single person undergoes it. It's a simple question of what is your blood type. You have a kid, a social worker comes to your house to make sure everything's right. Condescending to poor families. This is just if parents isn't religious, not allowing people into their homes. I'm sorry, the fact that parents may not want supervision is not a reason to let them abuse or neglect the kids, or let them have the ability and the option to abuse or neglect the kids. Cultural bias, again, give some credit to our court system, give some credit to our social workers that will know and be able to decide, and that we will create rules to make sure that they don't, take kids out every time, they don't like the color of the furniture. And in regard to money, money is always a good reason. But the same logic extends to saying that because it costs a lot of money to have cops, which we have more than 50,000 of, then we should allow people to commit violent acts, which is what neglect and abuse is. Now, moving on to my points. The fact is, what we're doing here is basically extending the status quo. Our proposition isn't creating some sort of odd anomaly. Today, we already supervise parents. We already make sure that they give their kids shots when it comes to physical health. We make sure they send their kids to school in the way of educational health and educational well-being. When it comes down to it, what we're doing today is taking the same logic and saying, why are we stopping here? This is not the place to stop. Emotional health is just as important, in some cases even more important, than just if the kid got his polio vaccine or not, seeing as polio is also a case of 1 in about 50,000. The logic that is behind this, the reason why the status quo is good, the reason why we do this interference is that the government understands. The government understands that it is the duty of the government to make sure that when you have someone who's unable to fend for himself, like a crazy person, like a child, we as the government step in and we do this for him. We make sure that he does not get neglected. We make sure that he just gets taken care of in the proper way. Like, at the end of the point. Additionally, not only that parents, like I was saying, can inflict a lot of emotional damage, and there's no reason to stop at physical damage and saying, okay, well listen, we'll take them to, when they come in for a checkup once a week, once a month, we'll make sure they give their kids the shots. We want to make sure that when parents are starting out on their way, that they're doing the things right, that they're not doing any sort of emotional abuse to their children. This is something that is just as important as their actual physical health, and that's what we call it mental health. It's another form of health. Additionally, furthermore, there is no reason to wait until the parent takes the kid in once a month. We don't want to wait until the neighbors call the cops, or until the neighbors call social, or until the grandparents would call, like the opposition here tries to tell us. We want to stop this before it happens. We want to make sure the social worker is there, so that when the parent does do some sort of abuse, he can stop it right away, and not wait till a couple of days later, a couple of months later, when it may be too late and the damage may be permanent. So, bottom line. As long as the status quo is, and as long as we understand that we supervise the well-being of children, as long as we understand that we have to protect the people that cannot fend for themselves, there's absolutely no reason to draw the line at the emotional health. The reason why we ask just for monitoring, and not just to remove the kids from the parents' care at the beginning and let them have them when they're older and ready, is that we understand the whole concept of privacy and the whole concept of the family structure, and this is why we're taking the proportional step of monitoring, of making sure that the parent is doing things right. Yes?
So we also have many cases of domestic violence. Can you please be the first one to answer? Do you support setting cameras in order to prevent?
Excellent. This is the perfect example. Domestic violence, we're speaking about adults. We're not speaking about children. An adult can call the police. An adult can take care of himself. Children cannot. The adult, when something happens, can do it. And again, cameras is not a proportionate step. We didn't ask to put cameras in the houses of all new parents. We're asking for the social worker to come in for some surprise visits at the beginning, not throughout the entire child's life, to take proportionate measures in order to avoid the cases of neglect and abuse. The next point comes down to children as guinea pigs. Now, not just because they're both cute, but this has to do with the fact that we don't want parents practicing on their kids. Bottom line is, when we get down to, when we look at the situation, is parents don't really have any other way of learning except hands-on experience. How do they learn? They have a kid, he cries, they yell at it, it doesn't help. So they try talking to it in soothing tones. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. They try rocking it, they try shaking it. Their only way of learning is hands-on. And while, like the opposition here tried to say, there's books and there's educational seminars we can give them in different, etc., etc., etc. First of all, if we're forcing them to study the books, then again, we're interfering with them, like they're saying. And books are not the same level of education. We understand when you're talking about something that's very important, something that's very risky, you need some sort of hands-on mentoring. You understand the added benefit of hands-on mentoring. This is why when you learn how to drive, you have to have someone who knows how to drive to teach you. You don't just read it in a book. This is why when you learn getting your gun license, you have someone to instruct you. This is why when you have when you come to university here, we could have read it in a book, but what? The fact that you have a professor speaking to you and explaining to you things hands-on is the way to actually learn in the best way. When talking about the risk to children, we have to make sure the parents are instructed in the best way possible. The way to do this is to make sure that when they're studying with their kid, when they're doing these, when they decide when the kid is yelling, they have someone on hand, or relatively on hand, to tell them if they're doing something right or something wrong. When they put the kid on the stomach, is that right? Is that wrong? On his back, right or wrong? These things are complicated, and something that is very important for us that parents do not just learn by trial and error, but rather have someone to supervise and make sure that when they're doing this trial and error, the errors are not too big. This is why, for these two reasons, we call on you to propose.